Good evening, and welcome back to Mythic Dreamscapes. Tonight we journey to the very edge of the world, to a place where sky meets earth, where the weight of eternity rests on a single pair of shoulders. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video if you enjoy exploring these ancient tales with me, and subscribe if you'd like more mythological deep dives. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. Now get comfortable. Dim the lights. Let the outside world fade away. Tonight we're going to meet one of mythology's most enduring figures, a titan who stands alone at the edge of existence, holding up the very heavens themselves. His name is Atlas, and his story is one of rebellion, punishment, knowledge, and an eternal burden that has captivated human imagination for thousands of years. Picture, if you will, the westernmost boundary of the ancient Greek world. Beyond the known lands, beyond the last settlements of humanity, where the sun sinks into the endless ocean each evening. Here, at this liminal space between earth and void, stands a figure of impossible size and strength. His shoulders are broad enough to support the dome of the heavens. His legs are pillars that have not moved for countless ages. His face, carved by suffering and determination, gazes out across an infinity he can never traverse. This is Atlas, the titan condemned by Zeus to hold up the sky for all eternity. When we think of Atlas today, we might picture a man straining beneath a globe, the image reproduced on maps and atlases throughout history. But the ancient Greeks imagined something different, something more cosmic and more terrible. Atlas did not hold the earth. He held the heavens themselves, the celestial sphere upon which the stars were fixed, separating the realm of sky from the realm of earth, ensuring that these two primordial forces never again embraced as they once had in the time before time. But Atlas was not always a prisoner at the world's end. Once he walked freely beneath those same stars. Once he stood among the mightiest beings in existence, a prince of the Titans during the Golden Age when they ruled all creation. His story is not simply one of punishment. It is a tale of cosmic war, of loyalty to a losing cause, of tricks and transformations, and of how even the mightiest can fall. It speaks to the nature of endurance, the meaning of burden, and the thin line between punishment and purpose. So settle in deeper now as we travel back to a time before Olympus, before Zeus threw his thunderbolts from heaven, to an age when Atlas walked freely and the sky had not yet become his prison. Let us begin at the beginning, in the age of Titans. In the beginning, before the gods we know, before temple or sacrifice, there was only chaos. Not the chaos of disorder we might imagine today, but something far more ancient. A yawning void, a primal emptiness from which all things would eventually emerge. From this nothingness came Gaia, the earth herself, vast and solid and brimming with potential. She was not a goddess who ruled the earth. She was the earth, every mountain and valley, every stone and grain of soil. And from her emerged Uranus, the sky, who stretched himself across her in an eternal embrace. Together, earth and sky brought forth the first generation of divine beings, 12 mighty titans, 6 sons and 6 daughters, each embodying elemental forces. There was Oceanus, the encircling river that marked the boundary of the world, Hyperion, blazing lord of light, Coeus, the axis around which the stars revolved, Crius, Iapetus, and Cronus, the youngest and most cunning of the males. Among the females were Thea, who would mother the sun and moon, Rhea, destined to become mother of gods, Themis, embodiment of divine law, Mnemosyne, living memory, Phoebe, the radiant one, and Tethys, goddess of the nourishing waters. But our story centers on one particular titan, one who would become central to both the age of titans and the age of gods that followed. Atlas was born to Iapetus, the titan associated with mortality in the west, and to Clymene, sometimes called Asia, one of the Oceanids, the 3,000 daughters of Oceanus. This made Atlas second-generation Titan, nephew to the great Cronus, who had overthrown Uranus and claimed rulership of the cosmos. Atlas was not an only child. He had 3 brothers, each of whom would play their own roles in the great dramas to come. Prometheus, whose name meant forethought, possessed a clever and rebellious mind that would one day steal fire from the gods and give it to humanity. Epimetheus, afterthought, was well-meaning but often foolish, the one who would accept Pandora as a gift and unleash suffering upon the world. Menoetius, the most obscure of the brothers, was known for his violent and arrogant nature, a warrior among warriors. These four brothers, sons of Iapetus, would each face their own fates when the old order crumbled. But in those early days, during the golden age of Titan rule, they knew only prosperity and power. The Titans ruled during a time of abundance. The earth gave freely of her fruits without need of cultivation. Humans, newly formed from clay by Prometheus, or sprung from stones or trees, depending on which tale you believe, lived in harmony. There was no war, no disease, no aging as we know it. Time passed differently then, measured not by human years, but by the slow turning of cosmic wheels. Atlas grew strong in this age. He was famed for his immense physical power, his broad shoulders and mighty frame. But he was not merely a brute. The ancient sources tell us that Atlas possessed great knowledge, particularly in the realms of astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy. He understood the movements of the stars, could calculate the seasons, knew the hidden paths of the celestial bodies. Some traditions credit him with inventing the first celestial sphere, a model of the heavens that allowed mortals to comprehend the dance of constellations. Whether this is true or merely legend layered upon legend, it speaks to how Atlas was perceived, a titan of both strength and wisdom, of physical might and intellectual brilliance. He walked the earth freely, observing the patterns of sky and sea, teaching early humans the art of navigation by the stars. Sailors who ventured across dark waters would invoke his name, this titan who understood the heavens better than any other. Farmers learned from him the proper times to plant and harvest by watching the stars' positions. In this way, Atlas was a benefactor to humanity, a teacher and guide. But this golden age could not last forever. Nothing does. The seeds of conflict had been planted long before, in the violent overthrow of Uranus by his son Cronus. That first act of rebellion, that first taste of divine blood, set a pattern that would repeat. For Cronus, having seized power through violence, lived in constant fear of prophecy. He had been warned that he too would be overthrown by his own child, and so he swallowed each infant born to his wife Rhea. Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, Hera, Hestia, Demeter, all consumed before they could draw a second breath. But Rhea, cunning as her husband, saved her youngest son Zeus by hiding him away and offering Cronus a stone wrapped in swaddling clothes. The Titan king, distracted or perhaps dulled by ages of unchallenged rule, swallowed the stone without noticing the deception, and Zeus grew to adulthood in secret, nursed by nymphs and protected by the Curetes, who clashed their spears against their shields to drown out his infant cries. When Zeus reached maturity, the rebellion began, and when it did, every being in the cosmos would be forced to choose a side. The age of Titans was ending. The age of Olympians was about to be born in fire and thunder. And Atlas, mighty Atlas, would make a choice that would define him for all eternity. The Titanomachy. The very name speaks of cosmic violence, of a conflict so vast that it shook the foundations of reality itself. For 10 long years, the heavens burned with divine fury as the old order clashed with the new. On one side stood the Titans, led by Cronus, defending their ancient dominion. On the other, the Olympians, Zeus and his siblings, freshly freed from their father's belly, fighting for their right to exist. This was not a war of mortal kingdoms or earthly territories. This was a war for control of the cosmos itself. Every Titan, every god, every primordial being had to choose where their loyalty lay. Would they side with tradition, with the established order, with Cronus who had ruled for ages uncounted? Or would they risk everything on these young upstarts, these Olympians, who dared to challenge their elders? Atlas made his choice. He stood with the Titans, with his uncles and cousins, with the old ways. Some accounts say he did more than simply stand with them. Ancient sources claim that Atlas was not just a soldier in this war, but a general, perhaps even the supreme commander of Titan forces. His strength was legendary. His tactical mind was sharp, and his knowledge of the heavens gave him insight into cosmic forces that others lacked. He led the Titans into battle against terrible odds. The Olympians were fewer in number, but possessed certain advantages. Zeus wielded thunderbolts forged by the Cyclopes, those one-eyed giants whom Cronus had imprisoned in the depths of Tartarus. When Zeus freed them, grateful for their liberation, they became his smiths and armorers, crafting weapons of immense destructive power, lightning that could split mountains, thunder that shook the pillars of heaven. But more than weapons, Zeus possessed an understanding that his father never had: the value of allies. Zeus did not simply free his siblings, he freed the Hecatonchires, the hundred-handed ones, those monstrous children of Gaia whom Uranus had shoved back into her womb in ages past. Cronus, following his father's example, had also kept them imprisoned. But Zeus released them, and in gratitude these beings of impossible power fought for the Olympians. Imagine them, if you can. Each possessed 50 heads and 100 arms. When they fought, they could hurl boulders in volleys like rain, 100 stones thrown simultaneously from each combatant. The Titans, mighty as they were, had never faced such assault. The war raged across the cosmos. Mountains were split and hurled as weapons, seas boiled, the very sky cracked with divine fury. Homer, that ancient bard, described Atlas as deadly-minded during this conflict, a being of terrible will and power. He stood at the center of the battle, leading his forces against the Hecatonchires barrage, against Zeus's lightning, against the fury of Poseidon's earthquakes and Hades' unseen attacks from the shadows. But courage and strength, even of such magnitude, cannot always overcome strategy and superior firepower. The Titans fought valiantly, but they were fighting the inevitable. Zeus had built a coalition, he had superior weapons, and perhaps most importantly, he had fate on his side. The same prophecy that had driven Cronus to such paranoid extremes had also set in motion his downfall. After 10 years of warfare, the Titans were defeated. Cronus was overthrown, bound in chains of unbreakable adamantine. Most of the male Titans were cast into Tartarus, that terrible pit beneath even the underworld, surrounded by bronze walls and wrapped in layers of primordial night. The Hecatonchires became their jailers, ensuring no escape would ever be possible. But Atlas received a different punishment entirely. Perhaps because he had led the resistance. Perhaps because his strength was too great to be contained even in Tartarus. Perhaps because Zeus, in his wisdom or his cruelty, understood that some punishments need to be visible. Whatever the reason, Atlas was not imprisoned in darkness. Zeus condemned Atlas to stand at the western edge of the world, at the very boundary where Oceanus encircled all lands, where the sun set each evening into the endless waters. There, Atlas would hold up the heavens upon his shoulders. Not the earth, as later confused artists would depict, but the sky itself, the vast dome of the celestial sphere. He would be the pillar that kept heaven and earth apart, ensuring they never collapsed back into the primordial embrace from which all things had emerged. This was to be his punishment, his burden, his purpose, and his prison, all in one. No chains were needed. The weight itself was his shackle. And there, at the world's end, Atlas took his position. He bent his back, he set his shoulders, he raised his arms, and he took upon himself the weight of the heavens, the stars, the moon, the sun in its daily journey, all the celestial bodies that wheeled through the firmament. All of this rested upon him, and he has held it there ever since, unmoving, eternal, enduring. Consider what it means to be sentenced to eternity, not metaphorical eternity, true, endless, unending eternity. No reprieve, no parole, no hope of release, every moment stretching into the next, every hour the same as the last, forever and ever without end. This was Atlas's punishment. Zeus had not killed him. Death in its way would have been a mercy. Instead, the king of the gods devised something far more exquisite in its cruelty, a punishment that would serve multiple purposes. It would remove a dangerous enemy from potential future conflicts. It would provide a necessary cosmic function, keeping the sky from falling. And it would stand as an eternal warning to any who might consider rebellion. Look upon Atlas, Zeus seemed to say. Look at the mightiest of Titans, general of their armies, brought low and broken. This is what awaits those who defy Olympus. But what exactly was Atlas holding? Ancient sources describe it in different ways. The poet Hesiod, one of our earliest authorities, speaks of Atlas holding up the wide heaven at the ends of the earth, standing before the clear-voiced Hesperides. Homer, in the Odyssey, describes Atlas as one who knows the depths of every sea, and he, Atlas, upholds the tall pillars which keep earth and heaven apart. Here the image shifts slightly. Atlas is not directly bearing the sky, but rather supporting the pillars that separate the two realms. Both descriptions capture the essential truth. Atlas is the barrier, the divider, the one who prevents the cosmos from collapsing back into chaos. Some later sources tried to rationalize the myth. They suggested that Atlas was actually a wise king who lived in northwest Africa, where the Atlas Mountains now stand, and that his great knowledge of astronomy led people to say figuratively that he held up the heavens. But the ancients believed in a more literal interpretation. They envisioned the sky as a solid dome, a celestial sphere upon which the stars were fixed points of light. This sphere rotated, carrying sun, moon, and stars across the heavens in their eternal dance. And Atlas was the axis, the fulcrum, the one who bore its weight and, by extension, turned it. His name itself speaks to this role. The etymology of Atlas is uncertain, but ancient Greeks and Romans believed it derived from the Greek word tlau, meaning to endure or to bear. Atlas was the enduring one, the bearer, the one who suffers but does not break. The Romans even gave him an additional epithet, Atlas telemon, enduring Atlas, emphasizing this fundamental characteristic. His position at the western edge of the world is significant. In Greek geographical imagination, this was the realm of sunset, where the sun god Helios completed his daily journey and descended into Oceanus to return to the east for the next dawn. This was the boundary of the known world, the place where civilization ended and mystery began. And here stood Atlas at this threshold, not quite in the world and not quite beyond it, liminal, perpetual, unchanging. What does such a burden feel like? We can only imagine. The ancient poets tried to capture it in their verses. They speak of Atlas groaning beneath the weight, of his shoulders pressed down by the heavy sky, of his unending toil, every muscle strained, every sinew stretched to its limit. The weight not just physical but metaphysical, the literal heaviness of all things above. No rest, no relief, even sleep was denied him, for if he faltered, if he weakened for even a moment, the sky would crash down upon the earth, undoing creation itself. His punishment was not merely to suffer, but to be essential. He could not be replaced, he could not be freed. The cosmos itself now depended on his continued suffering. There is a terrible beauty in this, a tragic dignity. Atlas did not beg for mercy. No myths speak of him pleading with Zeus for release. He simply endured, as his name proclaimed he would. He took his position, assumed his burden, and has held it ever since. But here is something the myths hint at, something almost more cruel than the physical burden itself: isolation. Atlas stands alone. No conversation, no companionship. The Hesperides, his daughters, tend their garden nearby, but they go about their work, caring for golden apples, and he cannot join them. He can see the world he once walked freely, can watch the sun rise and set, can observe the stars he once studied with such passion, but he cannot participate. He is frozen in place, a living monument to divine justice and divine wrath, and yet perhaps isolation brought its own kind of knowledge. Unable to move, unable to distract himself with travel or activity, Atlas had nothing but time and the heavens themselves to observe. He became the greatest astronomer, not by choice but by necessity. Every night, the stars wheeled above him. Every season, their positions shifted in the eternal dance of the celestial sphere. He learned their patterns more intimately than any being before or since. In this way, his punishment became a kind of mastery. He could not move, but he could see everything. He could not act, but he understood all. There is profound irony in Atlas's situation. Condemned to hold the heavens as punishment, he became the greatest expert on those very heavens. What was meant as a curse transformed into expertise. What was designed to humiliate granted him unique perspective. Standing at the edge of the world, Atlas could observe the sky as no one else could. Not from shifting positions on Earth, not through brief glances upward, but constantly, intimately, with the full dome of heaven literally resting on his shoulders. He felt every movement of the celestial sphere, every rotation, every subtle shift in the cosmic order, transmitted directly through his burden. In a sense, he was not just holding up the heavens, he was connected to them, part of their machinery, the axis around which all things turned. Ancient tradition credits Atlas with teaching humanity the art of astronomy. Before his punishment, legends say, he had already studied the stars, had already begun to map their movements and understand their significance. But after taking his eternal post, his knowledge became absolute. Sailors, those brave souls who ventured beyond sight of land, relied on star navigation. They learned to read the positions of constellations to determine their location, to predict weather patterns, to time their voyages. This knowledge, the Greeks believed, came ultimately from Atlas. Farmers too depended on celestial observations. Knowing when the Pleiades rose or when Orion reached a particular height in the sky told them when to plant their crops, when to harvest, when to prepare for winter. The agricultural calendar was written in the stars, and Atlas was the one who taught humanity to read it. Some sources even claim that Atlas invented the first celestial sphere, a physical model showing the positions of stars and their movements. This seems almost paradoxical. He could not move to build anything, could not take his hands from their eternal task of holding up the true celestial sphere. Perhaps the invention occurred before his punishment, or perhaps it is purely metaphorical, meaning that his knowledge was so complete that it was as if he had created a perfect model in his mind, a complete understanding of the heavens' mechanics. Regardless of the literal truth, the association stuck. Cartographers and astronomers in later ages would invoke Atlas when creating maps of the stars. His name became synonymous with celestial knowledge, with the mapping of heavens, with the understanding of cosmic order. This knowledge gave Atlas a certain power even in his powerlessness. Others needed his expertise. When Heracles sought the golden apples of the Hesperides, he needed Atlas's guidance to even find the garden. When sailors prayed for safe passage, they invoked the Titan who understood the stars that guided their journeys. In this way, Atlas remained relevant, remained connected to the world he could no longer walk. There's a deeper truth here, one that speaks to the nature of limitation and expertise. Sometimes being bound to a single place, a single task, a single focus, allows for a depth of understanding impossible to achieve through wandering. The scholar who spends a lifetime studying one subject often knows more than the one who samples many. The craftsman who perfects a single technique can achieve results beyond the generalist's reach. Atlas, bound to his one eternal task, became the undisputed master of that realm he was forced to hold. But knowledge, even profound knowledge, is cold comfort when you are frozen in place, unable to use that knowledge for your own benefit. Atlas understood the stars, but could never again walk beneath them. He knew the patterns of seasons, but experienced none of their variety. He comprehended the mechanics of the heavens, but remained their prisoner. This tension between wisdom and imprisonment, between expertise and powerlessness, defines Atlas's existence. He is the scholar locked in a library of his own body, the astronomer whose only telescope is his own unending observation, the teacher whose lessons come at the cost of eternal suffering. And perhaps this is why his figure resonates so deeply across the centuries. We understand at some level what it means to bear burdens, to be trapped by circumstance, to possess knowledge that cannot free us. Atlas holds up the sky, but in doing so, he also holds up a mirror to human experience. We see in him our own exhaustion, our own endurance, our own desperate hope that perhaps, just perhaps, the burden will someday lighten. At the far western edge of the world, near the place where Atlas stands with the heavens on his shoulders, there lies a garden of impossible beauty. This is the Garden of the Hesperides, and it is said to be the most perfect paradise anywhere in the mortal or divine realms. Here grow trees that bear golden apples, fruits of immortality given as a wedding gift by Gaia to Hera when she married Zeus. These are no ordinary apples. Anyone who eats them is said to gain immortality, though the gods who are already deathless guard them jealously from mortal lips. The trees themselves glow with an inner radiance, casting golden light across the garden. The grass is perpetually green. The air is sweet with floral perfume. Springs of clear water bubble up from the earth. And guarding these precious fruits are the Hesperides, nymphs of evening and sunset, daughters of the night. But here's where the story gets interesting. Various ancient sources give these nymphs different parents. Some say they are daughters of Nyx, the primordial night, born of darkness without need of father. Others claim they are offspring of the sea god Phorcys and the sea monster Ceto. But the most common tradition, the one that concerns us tonight, names them as daughters of Atlas himself. Atlas and Hesperis, personification of the evening, produced these divine nymphs who would guard Hera's sacred grove. Their names evoke their nature. Aegle, the dazzling light, Erythea, the red one of sunset, Hesper, the evening star, and Arethusa, though the specific names and even their number varies between 3, 4, or 7, depending on which ancient author you consult. Because of their father, they were sometimes called the Atlantides, daughters of Atlas. Think about the terrible beauty of this arrangement. Atlas stands frozen at the edge of the world, bearing an impossible burden, unable to move. And just beyond his reach, just close enough to see but impossibly far in terms of his ability to interact, his daughters go about their work. They sing as they tend the golden trees. They dance in the eternal twilight of the far west. They live in paradise, while their father suffers in place, a living pillar. Did they speak to him? Could they? Ancient sources don't say, but we can imagine. Perhaps they called out greetings that he could hear but not answer, his jaw clenched from the effort of holding up the heavens. Perhaps they left offerings of fruit and flowers at his feet, small gestures of love to one who could not embrace them in return. Or perhaps, and this is somehow more tragic, perhaps they eventually stopped noticing him at all. He became part of the landscape, like a mountain or a tree, present but not quite real, not quite a person anymore, just a function, a force, a burden bearer who happened to once have been their father. The garden itself was not protected by the Hesperides alone. Coiled around the tree that bore the golden apples was Ladon, a serpent dragon of immense size and terrible ferocity. Some accounts give him 100 heads, each capable of speaking in a different voice. Others say he never slept, his many eyes always open, always watching. This dragon was the final defense, ensuring that no one could steal Hera's precious apples. No one, that is, until a certain Greek hero arrived looking for a nearly impossible prize. But we'll get to that story in a moment. Atlas also fathered other daughters through different mothers. With Pleione, one of the Oceanids, he had 7 daughters who became known collectively as the Pleiades. Their individual names were Maia, Electra, Taigete, Alcyone, Celaeno, Sterope, and Merope. These sisters achieved fame as companions of Artemis, the virgin huntress goddess. They were beautiful, graceful, and beloved by many gods and mortals. But their beauty brought them trouble, as beauty often did in Greek myth. The giant hunter Orion became obsessed with them, pursuing the sisters relentlessly across the earth. The Pleiades fled, terrified, until Zeus took pity on them. Rather than see them caught, he transformed them into doves and then into stars, placing them in the heavens as a constellation. There they remain to this day, 7 bright stars in the Taurus constellation, among the most recognizable patterns in the night sky. Now here's the cruel poetry of it all. Atlas, holding up the heavens, literally supports his daughters above him. Every night the Pleiades rise and set, and their father bears them. They achieve a kind of immortality and freedom through their transformation, yet they remain forever in his care, forever part of the burden he must carry. Atlas also fathered the Hyades, another group of star nymphs associated with rain. When their brother Hyas died while hunting, killed by a wild animal, the sisters wept so inconsolably that Zeus transformed them as well into stars. The Hyades form another constellation, their tears becoming the rain they now herald when they rise in the autumn sky. So Atlas, the prisoner, the eternally suffering Titan, paradoxically fathered children who achieved freedom through transformation into celestial bodies. The irony is exquisite. He cannot move, cannot travel, cannot escape his burden. But his children dance across the heavens above him, free in a way he will never be again. They are both his legacy and his reminder of what he has lost. Every night as the Pleiades rise, Atlas holds them aloft. Every evening as the Hesperides sing in their western garden, their voices perhaps carrying to where he stands, he is reminded that life continues, that beauty persists, that there is still sweetness in the world. Just not for him. Never again for him. The story of Heracles and Atlas is one of the most famous encounters between hero and Titan, a tale of temporary relief and cruel deception that reveals much about both characters. Heracles, greatest of Greek heroes, son of Zeus and the mortal woman Alcmene, had been driven to madness by a jealous Hera. In his madness he killed his own wife and children. When sanity returned and he realized what he had done, Heracles sought purification and penance. The oracle at Delphi sent him to serve King Eurystheus of Mycenae, who would assign him 12 labors, 12 nearly impossible tasks designed to cleanse his guilt through suffering and achievement. The 11th of these labors was to fetch golden apples from the garden of the Hesperides. This was a task of peculiar difficulty. The garden's location was secret, hidden at the edge of the world. Even if you found it, you would have to bypass Ladon, the ever-wakeful dragon, and convince or compel the Hesperides to give up the apples they guarded. Heracles was strong, yes, the strongest mortal who ever lived, but strength alone would not suffice for this task. He needed knowledge, guidance, perhaps even a miracle. His wanderings in search of the garden took him across the known world and beyond. He fought the giant Antaeus in Libya. He freed Prometheus from his eternal torment on the Caucasus Mountains, killing the eagle that had gnawed the Titan's liver each day. And Prometheus, grateful for this liberation, gave Heracles crucial advice: seek out Atlas. Only the Titan would know exactly where the garden lay, for it was located near his post, and the Hesperides were, after all, his daughters. So Heracles journeyed to the western edge of the world. There he found Atlas, standing as he always stood, shoulders bent beneath the tremendous weight of the heavens, his position unchanged for countless ages. We might imagine the meeting. Heracles, travel-stained and weary, yet still radiating heroic vitality, approaching this colossal figure frozen in place. Atlas, perhaps surprised to see anyone, certainly curious about this son of Zeus who dared venture so far from civilization. The hero explained his quest. He needed golden apples from the nearby garden. He knew Atlas could not leave his post to fetch them. But perhaps, Heracles suggested, they could make an arrangement. What if Heracles temporarily took the burden? Atlas could walk free for the first time in ages, could stretch his limbs, could retrieve the apples from his daughter's garden, a task that would take him mere minutes or hours. Then he would return, give Heracles the apples and resume his eternal duty. Now put yourself in Atlas's position for a moment. You have stood without moving for ages beyond counting. Your shoulders ache with a pain so constant it has become your entire identity. Your muscles have been strained to their absolute limit for so long that you have forgotten what it feels like to stand upright, to move freely, to be anything other than a burden bearer. And now this young hero, this son of the king of the gods who condemned you, offers temporary relief. Would you trust him? Would you accept? Atlas agreed. But we have to wonder, did he believe Heracles would actually give the burden back? Or had a plan already begun forming in his ancient, clever mind? Heracles, demonstrating strength that justified his legendary reputation, positioned himself beneath the celestial sphere. Atlas, slowly, carefully, transferred the weight from his shoulders to the heroes. For the first time since the end of the Titanomachy, Atlas stood upright without burden. We can only imagine what that felt like. The sudden lightness, the ability to move, the overwhelming relief mixed with the phantom sensation of that weight he had carried so long. Atlas stretched. He rotated his shoulders. He took his first steps in ages, each movement probably agony and ecstasy combined, as unused muscles remembered their purpose. Then he strode toward the garden where his daughters tended the golden trees. The accounts vary on what happened next. In most versions, Atlas approached the garden, and either because the Hesperides knew him as their father, or because Ladon recognized the Titan who had stood guard over the region for so long, he gained entry easily. He He plucked several of the golden apples, perhaps 3, and returned to where Heracles stood, now groaning beneath the weight that had been Atlas's burden for so long. But when Atlas returned, he did not immediately move to take back the heavens. Instead, he made a proposal. Why should he resume this terrible burden? He was free now, actually free for the first time since the Titanomachy. Heracles was strong enough to hold the sky. Let the hero deliver the apples to King Eurystheus himself. Atlas would take them to Mycenae, claim credit for fetching them, and leave Heracles to bear the heavens forever. It was betrayal, yes, but understandable betrayal. Who could blame Atlas for seizing this chance at freedom? The trickster was about to be tricked, though. Heracles, despite his reputation for solving problems with brute strength, possessed a clever mind when he needed it. He pretended to agree to Atlas's proposal. Yes, of course Atlas should deliver the apples. Heracles would remain here, holding up the sky. But, he said, could Atlas take the weight back for just a moment? Heracles needed to fetch a cushion or adjust his cloak, or place padding on his shoulders to make the burden more comfortable, just for a minute, just to make arrangements for his new eternal duty. Atlas, who had endured eons of suffering but apparently lacked sufficient suspicion, agreed. He set down the golden apples, moved back into position, and lifted the heavens once more onto his shoulders. And the moment the weight transferred fully to the Titan, Heracles grabbed the apples and ran. He called back some kind of farewell or thanks, but he did not look back, did not slow down, did not give Atlas any chance to protest or pursue. And just like that, Atlas was back where he started. The brief respite, that tantalizing taste of freedom, was over. The trick within the trick had succeeded. The burden was his again. Ancient sources don't record Atlas's reaction. Did he rage? Did he weep? Did he simply accept it with grim resignation? One more disappointment in an existence defined by disappointment. We don't know. But we can imagine the bitterness, the sense of having been so close to escape, only to have it snatched away. There's a darker interpretation of this story that's worth considering. Perhaps Atlas never really believed he could escape. Perhaps he went along with the plan, knowing it was doomed from the start, seizing those few moments of freedom, not because he thought they would last, but because he needed to remember, just once more, what it felt like to move, to choose, to be something other than a burden bearer. Maybe the real tragedy isn't that he was tricked back into position. Maybe it's that he knew he would be and did it anyway. The story of Perseus and Atlas presents one of mythology's most interesting chronological problems and thematic transformations. Perseus was, of course, another son of Zeus, born to Danae, when the king of the gods visited her in the form of golden rain. Raised on the island of Seriphus, Perseus eventually undertook a quest to kill Medusa, the snake-haired Gorgon whose gaze turned any living thing to stone. With help from Athena and Hermes, who provided him with a mirrored shield, winged sandals, a bag to safely carry the severed head, and directions to where he might find Medusa, Perseus succeeded in his terrible task. He crept into the cave where Medusa lived with her 2 immortal sisters, used the mirror shield to avoid her deadly gaze, and cut off her head while she slept. Escaping from the cave, Perseus strapped on his winged sandals and flew away, the head of Medusa safely stored in his magical bag. His journey home took him across the world, and along the way, he encountered various adventures. He freed and married Andromeda after killing the sea monster that threatened to devour her. He turned various enemies to stone by revealing Medusa's head, and eventually, according to the poet Ovid, he flew past the Atlas Mountains in northwestern Africa and decided to seek rest and hospitality from their guardian, a great king who ruled those lands. Here's where the chronology becomes problematic. Perseus was the great-grandfather of Heracles, which would place the Atlas-Heracles encounter at least 2 generations after the Perseus story. So how could Perseus meet a still-living, still-mobile Atlas if Heracles would later meet the Titan frozen in place holding up the heavens? Different ancient authors offered different solutions to this contradiction. In Ovid's telling, the king Perseus encountered was not the Titan Atlas, but a different Atlas entirely, a mortal king of the region called Mauritania, roughly corresponding to modern-day Morocco. This King Atlas was said to be immensely wealthy, owning vast herds of sheep and cattle. But his most prized possession was a garden containing trees with branches and leaves and fruit all made of pure gold. This was a rationalization, an attempt to explain the myth in more realistic terms, but it captures something important. By Ovid's time, in the 1st century of our era, the literal belief in titans holding up the sky had waned. People preferred their myths with a veneer of plausibility, so the titan became a king, the golden apples became golden trees, and the eternal punishment became a cautionary tale. According to Ovid's account, this King Atlas had been warned by an ancient prophecy. A son of Zeus would one day come and steal his golden apples. So when Perseus arrived at his palace and announced himself as a son of Zeus, Atlas immediately refused him hospitality. He feared this was the prophesied thief, the one who would rob him of his greatest treasure. Perseus, tired from his journey and offended by this inhospitable treatment, grew angry. He had hoped for food, shelter, and rest. Instead, he received suspicion and rejection. So he reached into his bag and withdrew the head of Medusa. King Atlas looked upon it, met those dead eyes that retained their petrifying power even in death, and instantly transformed, but not merely into a statue of stone. Ovid describes it more grandly. Atlas's beard and hair became forests, his shoulders became mountain ridges, his bones became rock, his head became the summit, the highest peak. In moments, the king had become the Atlas Mountains themselves, a range that still bears his name. The irony of the prophecy is worth noting. Atlas feared a son of Zeus would steal his golden apples. Perseus did not steal them, but Heracles, another son of Zeus and Perseus's own great-grandson, would eventually do exactly that with the Titan Atlas's assistance. The prophecy was accurate, just aimed at the wrong generation and the wrong Atlas. There's something haunting about the image of Perseus's transformation curse. Atlas became a mountain. He was literally turned into stone, frozen forever in place. If we connect this back to the Titan Atlas, there's a parallel. The Titan too is frozen in place, unable to move, bearing a burden that has essentially turned him into a living monument. Both the Titan and the transformed king share this quality of being trapped, immobile, more landmark than person. Some interpretations suggest that the two Atlas figures are actually the same being, and that the story represents a second punishment or transformation. After Heracles' trick, perhaps Atlas somehow achieved a kind of release through petrification. Instead of consciously suffering and holding up the sky, he became the mountain unconscious stone that nonetheless served the same function. But this interpretation requires significant chronological gymnastics that most scholars reject. It's more likely that we're dealing with two separate traditions that later got tangled together. What endures, regardless of the truth behind the myth, is the image of Atlas as stone, as mountain, as permanent fixture of the landscape. Whether through Perseus's curse or through some other transformation, the connection between Atlas and the Atlas Mountains became fixed in the imagination. Ancient geographers and historians placed the Titan's location at these mountains. Travelers spoke of seeing them and imagining the Titan beneath or within them. The peaks became his shoulders. The ridgelines became his arms. The entire range was interpreted as a fallen god, a divine being trapped forever in geological form. There's a melancholy poetry to this. Atlas, who once walked freely, became utterly bound, condemned to hold up the sky. And then, in one version of his story, he became Earth itself, the mountain that cannot move even if it wanted to, the rock that feels nothing, endures everything, and will stand long after human memory of the Titan who gave it his name has faded into legend and then into nothing at all. Let's talk about what Atlas represents, because his story is not merely an entertaining tale of divine punishment. It is, like all enduring myths, a symbolic narrative that speaks to fundamental human experiences and questions. What does it mean to bear impossible burdens? What is the nature of endurance? How do we carry on when the weight threatens to crush us? These are the questions that Atlas, in his eternal suffering, helps us explore. First, and most obviously, Atlas represents the concept of endurance itself. His very name, as we discussed earlier, derives from the Greek word for to bear or to endure. He is the personification of carrying on despite overwhelming difficulty. Every human being faces moments when life seems unbearable, when responsibilities pile up, when we feel crushed beneath the weight of obligations, expectations, grief, or simply the effort of continuing. In those moments, Atlas is our mythic companion, the figure who says without words, "I understand, I too bear weight beyond imagining, and yet I stand." But there's more to it than simple endurance. Atlas's burden is not random. It is punishment, yes, but it also serves a cosmic function. If he failed, if he let go, the heavens would crash down upon the earth, destroying everything. His suffering maintains cosmic order. This adds a layer of meaning. Atlas represents not just burden-bearing, but necessary burden-bearing, the kind of weight we carry not because we chose it, but because someone must, because the alternative is worse. Consider the parent working multiple jobs to support their children, the caregiver who sets aside their own life to tend to an aging parent, the activist who fights for justice even when progress seems impossible. These are people who carry Atlas burdens, weight that cannot be set down because the consequences of letting go are unacceptable. There's dignity in this kind of burden, even as it crushes. Atlas also represents the relationship between physical and cosmic, between body and metaphysical reality. He holds up the heavens, the realm of the gods, the domain of stars and divine order. But he does so with his body, with muscles and shoulders and sheer physical strength. This collapse of categories, this image of bodily strength supporting spiritual or cosmic reality, speaks to how interconnected these realms are in Greek thought. The physical world and the divine world are not separate. They touch, overlap, depend on each other, and sometimes a being like Atlas is needed to literally hold them apart, to maintain the distinction between earth and heaven that allows both to exist. Now let's address the most common modern misconception about Atlas, the image of him holding up the earth itself. If you think of Atlas, you probably picture a muscular figure straining beneath a globe, the terrestrial sphere balanced on his shoulders or held in his hands. This image is everywhere, on logos, in artwork, as statues, even in tattoos. But it's wrong. The ancient Greeks and Romans never depicted Atlas holding the earth. They showed him holding the celestial sphere, the dome of the heavens with stars marked upon it. The confusion arose gradually over centuries. In the 16th century, when the Flemish cartographer Gerardus Mercator began publishing collections of maps and called them atlases in honor of the Titan, he featured images of Atlas on the title pages. But these images often showed Atlas holding a terrestrial globe, a sphere representing the earth rather than the heavens. This made sense for a book of maps, which after all dealt with earthly geography. But it began the confusion. Over time, the image of Atlas with a terrestrial globe became standard. The original meaning was lost or obscured. Today, most people who recognize Atlas recognize him incorrectly as the Titan who holds up the world rather than the Titan who holds up the sky. Does the distinction matter? Perhaps more than you might think. Holding up the earth suggests power, the ability to support and control the planet we live on. But holding up the heavens, keeping the sky from crushing down, preventing the return to primordial chaos, this suggests something different. It suggests the effort required to maintain structure, to keep things separate that would naturally collapse together, to preserve an order that requires constant, exhausting vigilance. The misunderstanding changes the metaphor in subtle but important ways. There's another symbolic layer worth exploring: Atlas as knowledge bearer. We discussed earlier his role as astronomer and teacher. This intellectual dimension of his character sets him apart from other punished figures in mythology. Prometheus endures eternal torture for stealing fire and giving it to humanity. Tantalus suffers eternal hunger and thirst for offending the gods. Atlas bears eternal weight. But uniquely among these punished figures, Atlas's punishment positioned him to gain unparalleled knowledge. He understands the heavens in their entirety. He knows the movements of stars, the cycles of seasons, the mechanisms of cosmic order. His suffering has made him wise. This introduces an interesting moral complexity. Is Atlas purely a victim? Or has his punishment also been a kind of initiation, a terrible but effective education? The Greeks loved such ambiguities. They understood that suffering could refine as well as destroy. that isolation could clarify as well as madden. Atlas stands at this intersection, neither simply victim nor simply sage, but both simultaneously, eternally. Finally, Atlas represents permanence and continuity in a changing world. Kingdoms rise and fall, empires crumble, gods themselves change and evolve. But Atlas remains at the western edge of the world, unchanging, holding up the same burden he has carried since the end of the Titanomachy. He is the fixed point, the eternal reference. In an uncertain cosmos, Atlas is certainty. In a world of transformation, Atlas is stasis. And there is something oddly comforting in this, even as we recognize the horror of it. One of the most unexpected twists in the story of Atlas is how this ancient titan, condemned to hold up the heavens at the edge of the world, eventually lent his name to books of maps and geographical knowledge. The connection is not immediately obvious. What does a figure of eternal punishment have to do with navigation and cartography? The answer lies in the Renaissance, in the ambitions of a brilliant Flemish geographer, and in the ancient associations between Atlas and knowledge of the earth and heavens. Let's travel forward in time now, leaving ancient Greece and Rome behind and arriving in the 16th century. Europe was in the midst of the age of exploration. Ships were sailing to continents unknown to classical civilization. The shape of the world was being dramatically redrawn. Old geographical assumptions were crumbling. New lands appeared on maps every year. This explosion of geographical knowledge created a need for comprehensive, up-to-date collections of maps. Enter Gerardus Mercator, born Gerard de Cremer in 1512 in Flanders, part of the Low Countries that today comprise Belgium and the Netherlands. Mercator was a polymath, skilled in mathematics, astronomy, instrument making, and especially cartography. He developed new techniques for map projection, including the famous Mercator projection that allowed sailors to plot courses as straight lines, a revolutionary innovation. But perhaps his most lasting contribution to geography was conceptual rather than technical. In the 1580s and 1590s, Mercator began publishing a comprehensive collection of maps, intended to provide a systematic view of the entire known world. This was not the first such collection. Other cartographers had created map compilations. But Mercator gave his collection a name that would stick forever. He called it an atlas. Why atlas? Mercator wrote about this in his dedication. He chose the name partly in reference to Atlas, the king of Mauritania, the rationalized, humanized version of the myth we discussed earlier. This Atlas was supposedly a wise king, learned in philosophy, mathematics, and especially astronomy. Mercator wrote that Atlas was the first to construct a celestial globe, the first to understand the heavens systematically. By naming his collection after this legendary scholar king, Mercator was claiming a lineage of geographical and astronomical knowledge stretching back to mythical antiquity. But there was more to it than that. Mercator certainly also had in mind the Titan Atlas, the figure who held up the heavens. On the title page of his atlas, Mercator included an illustration of Atlas, not holding a celestial sphere as the ancients depicted him, but holding a terrestrial globe, an image of the earth itself. This visual decision would have enormous consequences. It cemented the association between Atlas and terrestrial geography. Even though this was never the original mythological emphasis, it began the confusion we still have today about what Atlas was actually holding. But symbolically, it made a kind of sense. Mercator was presenting a book that attempted to encompass the entire world, to hold all geographical knowledge in one place. Who better to represent such an ambition than Atlas, the figure whose strength and endurance allowed him to bear the weight of cosmic structures? The name caught on immediately. Other cartographers began calling their map collections atlases. The word entered common usage. By the 17th century, atlas meant a book of maps in multiple languages. The connection to the mythological figure became assumed, background knowledge that didn't need explanation. Today, the word has been completely naturalized. We say atlas without thinking of the Titan at all, just as we say cereal without thinking of Ceres, goddess of grain, or plutonium without thinking of Pluto, god of the underworld. The mythological origin has been absorbed and forgotten. But there's a deeper symbolic appropriateness here. An atlas, a book of maps, is indeed a kind of burden-bearing. It attempts to carry the weight of geographical knowledge, to organize and support an understanding of the world's layout. The cartographer, like Atlas, must be precise, careful, and strong in their craft. A mistake in a map could lead sailors astray, could cost lives. The responsibility of accurate cartography is, in its way, a burden worthy of the name Atlas. Moreover, there's the element of perspective. Atlas, standing at the edge of the world, possessed a unique vantage point. He saw connections that others missed. He understood patterns invisible from within civilization. Similarly, a well-made atlas offers a god's eye view, a perspective impossible to achieve on the ground. You can see the whole continent laid out, can trace rivers from source to delta, can understand how mountains form barriers and plains form highways. The atlas gives you Atlas's perspective, comprehensive, elevated, vast. The naming also tied into Renaissance ideas about knowledge and the rediscovery of classical wisdom. Mercator and his contemporaries saw themselves as recovering and extending the learning of the ancient world. By invoking Atlas, a figure from classical mythology associated with wisdom and astronomical knowledge, Mercator was claiming his place in a tradition stretching back thousands of years. His atlas was not merely a collection of modern maps, it was a continuation of a scholarly project begun in antiquity. The influence of this naming decision spread beyond mere cartography. The name Atlas became associated with bearing knowledge in general. We speak of something being an atlas of philosophy or science or anatomy, meaning a comprehensive, systematic reference work. The atlas figure became emblematic of the scholar or expert who bears the weight of their discipline, who supports and upholds a structure of knowledge. Even the Atlantic Ocean owes its name ultimately to Atlas. The Greeks called the sea beyond the Pillars of Heracles, the Western Ocean where Atlas supposedly stood, the Atlantic, meaning the Sea of Atlas. When the full extent of this ocean became known during the Age of Exploration, the name stuck and expanded. The ocean that separates Europe and Africa from the Americas, the ocean that early modern sailors had to cross to reach the New World, is still called after the Titan who stood at its edge. And so Atlas, who stood frozen at the westernmost boundary of the ancient world, ended up giving his name to the geographical and navigational tools that would help explorers push far beyond that boundary, to the ocean that would become a highway of exploration, and to entire systems of organizing and presenting geographical knowledge. His reach, paradoxically, expanded even as he himself remained locked in place. The burden-bearer became the namesake of knowledge-bearers, and his eternal suffering was transformed into something almost hopeful. The human drive to map, to explore, to understand, to carry the weight of knowing the world. Atlas's story did not end with ancient Greece and Rome. Like all powerful myths, it evolved, was reinterpreted, forgotten, and rediscovered across the centuries. Each age found something different in the figure of the burden-bearing Titan, shaped his meaning to fit their concerns, their anxieties, their understanding of suffering and endurance. Let's trace this journey through time, watching how Atlas transforms while remaining fundamentally himself. In ancient art, Atlas appears with surprising frequency. Greek vase paintings show him in various scenes, most commonly the encounter with Heracles, where the hero takes his burden. Later, Roman copies of Greek sculptures depicted Atlas holding the celestial sphere. The most famous of these is the Farnese Atlas, a marble statue dating to the 2nd century AD, now housed in the National Archaeological Museum in Naples. This sculpture shows Atlas kneeling, his shoulders bent under the weight of a globe carved with constellations. His face is weathered, exhausted, the portrait of eternal suffering captured in stone. This statue survived the fall of Rome, was preserved through medieval times, and became immensely influential during the Renaissance when it was rediscovered. When medieval Christianity swept across Europe, the old gods were demoted to demons or reduced to moral exemplars in allegorical texts. Atlas appears occasionally in medieval literature, usually as an example of pagan folly or as an allegorical figure representing some Christian virtue or vice. He lost his power as an object of belief, but retained his power as an image, a story, a teaching tool. But the Renaissance changed everything. When European scholars and artists rediscovered classical texts and art, they also rediscovered the emotional and aesthetic power of pagan mythology. Suddenly, Atlas was everywhere. Paintings depicted him straining beneath his burden. Sculptures placed him at the entrances to libraries and palaces. His image adorned books and manuscripts. Artists were drawn to the visual drama of his situation. Here was a figure of monumental scale and obvious suffering, perfect for demonstrating artistic skill in depicting anatomy, emotion, and movement, frozen in stasis. The great Renaissance and Baroque artists painted or sculpted Atlas repeatedly. Titian, Rubens, and countless others produced versions of the Atlas myth. What's interesting is that these artists often emphasized different aspects. Some showed Atlas as noble, dignified even in defeat, bearing his burden with stoic resignation. Others showed him as tortured, muscles straining, face twisted in agony. Still others depicted him as almost peaceful, having achieved some kind of acceptance of his fate. Each interpretation told us as much about the artist's time and philosophy as about the ancient myth itself. In literature too, Atlas experienced a revival. The romantic poets of the 18th and 19th centuries loved figures of tragic grandeur, and Atlas fit perfectly. He appeared in epic poems, in dramatic works, in lyrical meditations on suffering and endurance. Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, John Keats, all invoked Atlas at various points, using him as a symbol of the human condition, the artist's burden, the weight of knowledge, or simply magnificent suffering. Moving into the modern era, Atlas took on new meanings in new contexts. The rise of psychology, particularly Jungian psychology, interpreted mythological figures as archetypes, universal patterns in the human psyche. Atlas became the archetype of burden-bearing, the part of ourselves that endures, that perseveres, that bears responsibility. Psychologists spoke of people having an Atlas complex, meaning they feel compelled to carry burdens that perhaps aren't entirely theirs to carry, that they've internalized a need to support others or to maintain structures that might survive without their constant effort. The philosopher Ayn Rand famously titled her magnum opus Atlas Shrugged, imagining what would happen if the most productive members of society, the creators and builders who hold up civilization, simply walked away from their burden. Her novel was controversial and remains so, but the use of Atlas as a metaphor was immediately understood. He represented those who bear the weight of the world, and the title's question was, what if they stopped? In popular culture, Atlas appears constantly, often in ways that show how deeply his image has penetrated collective consciousness. Comic book characters bear his name. Rockets and space missions have been called Atlas, invoking the strength needed to reach the heavens. Buildings are adorned with Atlas statues, most famously the massive bronze sculpture at Rockefeller Center in New York City, created by Lee Laurie with the help of René Paul Chambellan and installed in 1937. This Art Deco Atlas holds an armillary sphere representing the celestial heavens, his muscles rippling, his expression determined. Standing 15 feet tall with the entire statue reaching 45 feet, he has become one of the most photographed statues in the world, a tourist landmark and a symbol of New York's ambition and endurance. Architecture makes constant use of Atlas. Caryatids, those columns carved in the form of female figures, have a male equivalent called Atlantes or Telemones, columns in the form of muscular male figures who appear to hold up the building above them. These architectural Atlas figures can be found throughout Europe, visual reminders of the original myth translated into functional form. There's something about Atlas that continues to resonate. Perhaps it's because we all feel at times that we are holding up more than we can bear. The modern world piles responsibilities upon us. We are expected to maintain careers, relationships, health, finances, to stay informed about global affairs, to be good citizens, good family members, good friends. The weight can feel crushing. And in those moments, Atlas speaks to us across millennia. He says, I know, I understand. I too carry impossible weight. In social and political discourse, the Atlas metaphor gets deployed frequently. We speak of people or institutions as bearing the burden of society. We worry about what happens if the caregivers, the teachers, the essential workers, those modern atlases, can no longer carry the weight placed upon them. We see in Atlas a warning and an aspiration. The warning that even the strongest can be overburdened. The aspiration that perhaps we too can endure, can continue bearing what must be borne. And so we return at last to where we began, to the western edge of the world, to that liminal space where Atlas stands with the heavens upon his shoulders. We've traveled through his story, from his origins as a Titan prince, through the catastrophic war that ended his freedom, through encounters with heroes, through transformations and metaphors and cultural reinterpretations. And through it all, one thing remains constant: Atlas endures. What can we learn from this ancient myth? What does Atlas, with his eternal burden, have to teach us across the vast gulf of time that separates his story from our lives? Perhaps the most obvious lesson is about endurance itself. Atlas represents the human capacity to bear suffering, to continue functioning under impossible weight. We all face moments when life becomes overwhelmingly difficult. Illness, grief, financial crisis, heartbreak, the slow accumulation of responsibilities and disappointments. In these moments, we learn what we are made of. We learn whether we can endure. Atlas, standing at the world's edge for eternity, tells us that endurance is possible. The burden may never lighten, the weight may never decrease, but we can continue to bear it, we can stand, we can hold. But there's more than simple endurance here. Atlas's burden is not meaningless. He holds up the heavens. If he failed, cosmic order would collapse. This introduces the concept of necessary burden, weight that must be carried not because we choose it, but because the alternative is worse. How many of us carry Atlas burdens in our own lives? The parent who cannot rest because children depend on them. The doctor who continues working through exhaustion because patients need care. The activist who fights for justice even when progress seems impossible. These are not optional burdens. They are necessary ones. And recognizing them as such, understanding that we bear weight not out of weakness but out of necessity, can transform how we experience them. Atlas also teaches us about dignity in suffering. He does not beg. He does not complain. He does not rage against his fate, at least not in the ways the myths record. He simply stands and holds. There is a kind of nobility in this, a refusal to let suffering reduce him to nothing but his pain. He remains Atlas, mighty Atlas, enduring Atlas, even in his punishment. We too can choose how we bear our burdens. We can let them crush our spirits, or we can stand like Atlas, acknowledging the weight but not being defined entirely by it. The myth also explores the relationship between punishment and purpose. Atlas's burden is punishment for rebellion, for choosing the wrong side in a cosmic war. But it also serves a purpose. He maintains order. His suffering is not random or meaningless. It accomplishes something essential. How often in our own lives do our difficulties serve purposes we don't immediately recognize? The struggle that seems pointless may be building strength we'll need later. The burden that seems purely punitive may be teaching us something crucial. Atlas reminds us that suffering can have meaning, even when it feels meaningless, that punishment and purpose are not always opposites. There's also something to be said about knowledge born from limitation. Atlas, frozen in place, became the greatest astronomer because he could not stop watching the heavens. His punishment gave him perspective and understanding impossible to achieve any other way. When we find ourselves limited, trapped, unable to do what we wish, we might remember Atlas. Sometimes the deepest knowledge comes not from freedom, but from being forced to look closely at the thing right in front of us, the thing we cannot escape. And finally, Atlas teaches us about legacy and transformation. He was a Titan who lost a war, who was punished, who suffered. But his name endures. He gives his name to mountains, to an ocean, to books of maps, to architectural forms, to works of philosophy and literature. His story has been told and retold for thousands of years. In the end, his eternal burden has earned him a kind of immortality. His suffering was not the end of his story. It became the thing that made his story worth telling. Perhaps there's comfort in that. The burdens we bear, the weights that seem to crush us, may become the very things that define our significance, that give our lives meaning and weight in the memories of those who come after. Atlas stands at the edge of the world still, at least in our imagination. The weight on his shoulders has not lightened. The centuries have not brought him relief. But he has achieved something the gods who punished him perhaps did not intend. He has become a symbol of something greater than himself. He represents every person who has ever borne impossible weight and continued standing. He is every caregiver, every soldier, every person who endures because they must. He is the part of the human spirit that refuses to break no matter how heavy the burden. If you've made it this far in our journey tonight, if you've walked with me to the edge of the world and stood for a moment beside Atlas, feeling the weight of the heavens pressing down, then perhaps you understand why this myth has endured. It speaks to something fundamental in the human experience, the necessity of endurance, the dignity possible even in suffering, the transformation of burden into meaning. So as we prepare to leave this place, as we step back from the edge of the world and return to our own lives with our own burdens, let us remember Atlas. Let us remember that strength is not about never feeling the weight. It's about continuing to stand beneath it. Let us remember that endurance is not passive acceptance. It's active resistance, a choice made every moment to keep holding, keep bearing, keep standing. Before you go, if you enjoyed this journey into mythology, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Mythic Dreamscapes. Let me know in the comments what mythological figure you'd like to explore next. There are so many stories left to tell, so many ancient voices still waiting to be heard. Thank you for listening. Thank you for bearing with me through this long tale. May your own burdens be bearable, and may you find, as Atlas did, a kind of strength in the very act of enduring. Good night, and may the stars guide your way home.